everyone. Thank you all for sticking around for this Smart Grid security session. Thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Emil Gurevitch. I'm a security architect at Network Identity Services, and we're a smart grid solutions vendor specializing in smart meter systems. And it's my job to make sure those systems are secure, not just to date, but also for tomorrow. And we're working in close collaboration with UAS to bring secure, reliable, and valuable smart meter systems to the African market. My background is actually in breaking security, not trying to secure systems. I started at a very young age being consumed with breaking systems for fun, but that led to a very interesting career in information security. In the past 2-3 years, I've been on the defending side of things, trying to create security technologies that prevented me from breaking those systems and other people like me. My presentation is divided into 3 sections: context, attack, and defense. Context, I'll give you a crash course in what a smart meter system is from a security perspective. Then we're going to switch focus and look at it from an attacker's perspective. And then we're going to switch again to the defending side to see what we can do to prevent these attacks from being a reality, and what pitfalls there might be on the defending side. And to begin with, I just want to say all of the key points that I will convey to you today are lessons hard learned from the European region. As you know, in that region, we already have a lot of smart meter deployments. So I hope that these lessons learned will resonate with you, and you can take them into consideration as you adopt these smart meter solutions yourself. Context. So here's a smart grid. Let's start there. This is sort of a standardized approach to defining a smart grid. You'll see here different domains that constitute a smart grid. And the electricity flows from generation, transmission, distribution, and finally to the customers. That should all be familiar. Now, what makes a smart grid smart is all the data exchanges. There was a really good acute question that targeted or addressed the concern of having these virtual networks that are sharing data. And that is exactly right. That is the underpinning of this smart grid, that data can be exchanged seamlessly and extremely fast from one domain to the other. And this is what enables all those efficiency promises that the smart grid brings to the table, but it also creates complex information security systems that are hard to secure. So there are both good things and bad things, but certainly it is a security challenge. Every time we connect domains to each other, there is a new opportunity for something to go wrong. Now, a smart meter system is directly touching 3 of those domains listed here. They're touching the central operations, the provider, and the customer. Again, this is where they physically touch. However, the smart metering data that the utility collects feeds into the other domains, such as grid optimization, applications, and so on. So if you zoom further in and look at it from a utility's perspective that just bought this shiny new smart meter system, from a sort of an architecture perspective, this is what it looks like. Again, the orange lines are the data connections that makes up for the smart grid network, or the smart meter network. On the top, you have the utility, and then we have a layer that is right below the central system of what we usually call data concentrators. And each data concentrator is responsible for managing 500 to 1,000 smart meters. And this is what we call a domain. Now, there can be millions of smart meters, so this is just a tiny little segment of the smart meter system. If we zoom further in, we can get an understanding of what technologies are at play here. So now you have the central system at the far left, and that's directly connected to the data concentrator, usually over an internet connection. So the same network that we connect our phones to receive emails, these field devices are connected to as well. On the other side of the data concentrator there in the middle, there is a multitude of different ways to communicate to the meters that sits in the homes in this illustration. There is power line communication, and there is wireless communication such as RF, which creates this mesh network of communications. In the house itself, there can be residential applications for the smart meter. I'm sure you've seen those readings, little panels that shows you your current energy consumption, or might even provide you information on when it's a good time to use energy financially or economically. So there is a lot of, as you can see, again, a lot of connections through this smart meter system. And then you have on the bottom left there, from the central system to directly to a smart meter over the internet, and those we call point-to-point connections. So these are popular in low-density areas, for example, in the countryside, where you don't have a need for putting up a data concentrator because there's not going to be 1,000 customers in the countryside. So here, it makes a lot of sense to have a direct connection to the smart meter. And that should give you sort of an overview from a systems perspective what we're dealing with. And again, I want to draw your attention to all the different connections that we're seeing in these smart meter systems. And here is a smart meter. So now we're at the very end of our context here. And here's a smart meter. And there are different applications for this smart meter, as I mentioned. The first use case that utilities use are billing, right? You replace the old meters that record your energy consumption with these new computers, and then instead of having your customers read out whatever the meter says and send it back to you, you can just collect the data through the network. And that's where efficiency comes in, and you also have a much better accuracy in terms of forecasting and usage of your network. But it extends further than billing. The majority of cases in smart meters, there is an on and off switch. So a utility can control the power flow to your customer. So if the customer is not paying or the utility is suspecting some unlawful behavior, they actually have the capability at the central system to turn off the power. There's also other applications such as grid mapping, which grid operations are looking into. So you now have this ability to monitor voltage and energy balances at the very edges of your grid, and that data can feed into some analytics engine combined with your geographical database, and will give you a much better insight into your actual infrastructure. And the list goes on. There's a lot more happening with smart meter data. It's getting more and more integrated into other systems. From a security perspective, there are two key points I want to bring your attention to, and that is these meters, once a utility puts them out there, they're expecting them to be in the field 15 to 20 years. 15 to 20 years, this smart meter has to be a secure platform for collecting data and preventing people from turning it off. Remote firmware updates is another important security characteristic of a smart meter system. These networks are very slow to communicate, especially at the very edges of the grid where the meters are connected. So it takes a long time for a security update to reach the smart meters. So when a utility finds out that there is a vulnerability in a smart meter system, they're looking at a 3 to 6 months period, first with planning and then the rollout, in order to fix that vulnerability. Those are completely different dynamics than we're used to from original IT. So, to summarize, the key points of the context are as follows. Smart grids are highly interconnected. There is this theme in the beginning of this convention, a very nice, good theme that I fully support about integrity. And we can apply that same thinking to smart meter systems and information security systems in general. If the data that flows through all those domains in the smart grid can't be trusted, you're going to make decisions that you will regret. So the integrity, the correctness, the authenticity of the data is extremely important to get right. The second one is that every single meter is a potential access point for attackers to breach through the system. And since there's millions and they're at the very edges of the grid, which is very high exposure and the utility loses control, that's going to be a very difficult thing to protect. At least it's something we need to recognize as we deploy and secure these systems. And finally, there's a mix of technologies. There is a completely different stack of technologies once you zoom further in the technology stack. So that was context. Now we're going to switch focus a bit and look at the attacking side. So the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what is it we're trying to protect in a smart meter system? You always want to start with, what are my assets? And here is a general overview. Since the smart meter system is capable of turning off electricity, your asset as a service provider and electricity provider is that you need to protect this service that we all rely on in a modern society. Since there is an off switch, the attackers can use that as a turn power off, and that will cause power outages. Then, of course, the data is fundamental to these utilities that run on these smart meter systems. They're relying on the data to be available and authentic at all times. If that data is tampered with or even lost, that's going to have a really high impact on business operations. And then there's this hardware asset. And this is something that are often overlooked. But again, you invest so much in this infrastructure. You're putting up smart meters, replacing physical devices in your grid in a very large scale, millions of devices. The problem is that these are computers, and they can be reprogrammed over the network. This is what we call firmware updates. So an attacker might be able to push out a new update that causes the meter to malfunction, and malfunction to such a degree that it has to be replaced physically. So if you're a utility, this is one of your worst case scenarios, that you have to replace your investment after you deployed it. And finally, reputation. It varies how important this is. I'm from Denmark, actually, and reputation is extremely important in this market because the switching cost for us as customers, utility customers, is extremely low. It takes me 5 minutes to change utility. So if the utility I'm currently using has a really poor reputation of securing their data, I'm going to switch over. So if it so happens that there's going to be a lot of outlets claiming that I have poor security as a utility, they're going to lose customers. So lack of trust in the market. Now, sort of a final comment on this slide. I'm not trying to instill fear or anything. It's just very important that we understand what this technology actually is capable of from an attacker's perspective. Good. So now we understand what we need to protect and what might happen if those assets are misused. Now we should talk about who. Who are we up against? Who would want to do such a thing? And there are different ways to tackle this, and it's a nuanced picture. But I like this way of classifying our adversaries. And this is sort of a diagram that tries to make it very clear that there are two very distinct actors that we need to care about. This is Bruce Snyder's attacker classification. So on your right, further the right, the higher the skill of our adversaries. And the further up, the more narrow a focus you have as an adversary. So at the very highest, you only care about one specific utility. At the very lowest, you don't care who, just how many. So now we can plot our actors here. There's the nation state, right? They have a very specific focus on a certain utility or a certain region of the world. And this is where we are seeing very critical impacts. I'm sure you've read about it, the cyber attack in the Ukrainian power grid, which all things indicate that this was a nation-state-sponsored cyber attack. So these guys are high-skill, high-focused, but they are infrequent. Not saying they will never happen, but they don't happen every week, which leads us to our next adversaries, the criminals. And they are mostly motivated by monetary incentives. We're seeing an exponential increase in ransomware campaigns where criminals take away information security systems or data and demand a ransom in return. This is an actor we really have to, to focus on a lot because they're very frequent. And even though we don't hear much about the results of these attacks, they do happen. There have been campaigns in Scandinavia, in Europe, which had very high impact on business operations. So those are the two people or two adversary groups that I like to bring in order to understand who we're up against. Now, the next question, of course, is how. And as a past hacker of smart meter systems, there's basically sort of a way you can approach it. There are 3 different ways. There is the top-down, which is by far the most effective in 2017, because this is where the human element resides. You go through the central system, and then you have full control like the utility has. Then there is the middle down, where you attack the internet connections, internet-connected devices that I mentioned in the beginning, and then go down to the smart meters. And this has sort of a stealth property from the attacker's perspective, because you might be able to do this without alerting the central system up there. It remains yellow, but you still have control of the smart meter system. And then finally, the bottom-up part, which I have been studying a lot. And this is where you start from your living room with your smart meter system, or your smart meter, and then break up from there. There are some physical constraints. A signal can only carry you this far, but you might be able to move laterally through neighborhoods by jumping one smart meter to the other. And then the other approach is to go directly to the data concentrator from your home and then take control of the neighborhood. Again, these are just some outlines for you to understand where the weaknesses might reside in a smart meter system. So hopefully that gives you some context on what we're dealing with and who we're up against and what's at stake. So let's switch to the defending side here. Here we go. So there are many technology-provided technology-provided defenses that are out there. I don't think the problem is the lack of security technology or technical solutions. The problem resides in selecting them. I do believe we actually have a proper portfolio of security technologies, even for smart meter systems, but I think the adoption is not there yet. So I won't be going into details about the technical solutions. Of course, you can find me after the talk, and I'll be happy to talk to them. So I'd much rather bring your attention to sort of the more human element, the decision makers in this smart meter system deployments. And there are certain pitfalls I want to highlight. And these are all experiences I've had firsthand in Europe. So one of the actually very surprising things I've seen firsthand is that SLAs, getting your data availability at a 99% is sometimes a service level agreement, or some performance number you have to reach as a utility. If you don't, it's end of business. And I've seen pilots that were successful at meeting that KPI, but then once the utility deployed the system in their production systems, their security team came over and said there is no security enabled. They enabled the security, and then their KPIs plummeted. And then a utility gets desperate, because without meeting these key performance numbers, they're out of business. So they will flip the switch on security in order to survive, and I don't blame them at all. But this is a major concern. So even though it looks good on paper, behind closed doors, there might be things going on here that shouldn't be going on. So here's a quote. Of course, there is no attribution here, but we did not meet SLAs, and turning off security helped. I actually hear from utilities that they want an off switch in their smart meter system, and that's not the right way to go. Because it's very simple that if your smart meter solution forces you to turn off security to meet your performance requirements, you're not using the right technology. The right technology is there, they're being deployed, and they have been deployed for years. Unfortunately, this case might be using the wrong technology. So I'm trying to say that you can have the cake and eat it too, in fact, when it comes to security, which is a good thing. So yeah, turning off security leads to zero security and untrusted data, which brings us back to our past point. The next thing is security by compliance. And this is a pitfall I've seen many times in other industries as well. So I've tried to visualize it here with a diagram. So security posture, how well you're securing your systems, goes up. The higher the bar, the better you're doing. And if you enforce some standard or some regulatory certification or something, that's good actually, because it does enforce a minimum baseline of security, which forces companies to invest in security. But their actual target is way up here. So in order to get there, we need to take a different approach. We need to go beyond compliance, and that is the risk-based approach. Now, again, I'm not going to be going into details here, but just know that in order to catch up and continue to improve security, you need to be going through these cycles of improvement. Identify your weaknesses, improve them, and then have them analyzed by experts and reiterate. This is how you keep up. My final pitfall for today is neglecting detection and response. There's a very big focus on protecting assets, and unfortunately, that is not enough. And I'm going to try to give you some mental tools to reason about this, because it might be too abstract to think about when you look at the technology specifications. So I should say security is about protecting, detecting, and responding to misuses of your assets. So here is my sort of mental model of protection. Protection to me is a maze. You put your most valuable asset in the middle, your electricity service, for example, and then you try to build a maze around it. And in order to build a more complicated maze, you build protective measures. So here we have authentication and access control. That means not everyone can just go and pick up our gold star. You have to be authorized to do so. And then you might go further and say there needs to be integrity protection on our data. Even though people pick up the gold star, if someone tampers it, we'll find out. And encryption, so if we move the gold star, it's going to be encrypted along the way, and so on. We spent a lot of money in all these protective measures, and that leads us to this big, big maze, which is good. It's great, but the thing is, it's a maze. So given the right adversary, which leads us back to our threat model, there's going to be a way for some high-skill, high-focus people or adversaries to break through. Even criminal organization may pick up a cyber tool left over by some nation state and actually achieve this at a very low cost, as we've seen in the past. So protection is important. So wouldn't it be great if we could actually find out who picked it up and if they actually stole it? And this is where detection comes in. So here is my mental model of a detection. South Africa is crazy about soccer, and I grew up in Denmark, and we are as well, so I hope this picture resonates with you. So who do you think is the most important man in this, or person in this picture? So if you're guessing the cameraman, then you would be absolutely right. The person that took this photo is the most valuable one in this situation. He knows that that someone scored. If you ask the goalkeeper over there, he might not even know it happened. And we actually can see it's the attacking team. It's number 9, so we have some sort of initial attribution to the attacker. So this is the core part of detection. Because the problem is, if you don't have good detection, you're going to end up in a situation where it's too late. You want to avoid this. I've been to many cleanup jobs after a big cyber attack, and it's very, very difficult to recover from. So you really want to invest in timely detection systems. Which leads us to respond. And this is where a checklist, when it comes to security, makes a lot of sense. You want to plan for those worst-case scenarios that I listed out before. It shouldn't just be a slide. It should actually be part of your incident response plan. So go through the worst-case scenarios. Make sure you understand them. Make sure you have an incident plan to react. Now I want to check time here. 24 minutes. Okay. That was my last pitfall here. And it is not my intention to instill any doubt or fear of this technology. I'm actually a believer in the promises of smart grid, and I do believe we have the security technology to assist us. But it is up to the industry as a whole to embrace the right technology and go beyond standards, go beyond regulations. Security is more than that. And that is my final advice to you guys today. So here is a poster. These slides will be available, so I really hope you'll print it out maybe and put it up on your wall. That would make me very happy. Thank you very much for listening. Again, my contact email is up here. I will be here with the UAS, our trusted partner in developing and deploying these smart meter systems in South Africa. We'll be around to take questions. Thank you very much for listening.